Well, welcome all today. It's great to see that there's a fantastic presence online as well as in the room. So first of all, welcome to the Marine Studies Institute event. I'm going to pass over to Frances, who's going to do an acknowledgement of country.
Thanks so much, Eleanor. Today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today and discussing these important issues about the importance of land and culture for all of us. This is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in which we meet. I acknowledge Indigenous people here present and participating in this conversation, and also the knowledge and leadership shown by Indigenous people past, present and emerging.
Great. So if we can get the slides up, I just want to give you a quick introduction to the Marine Studies Institute, and then we'll introduce the event itself. So really, MSI is very much a multidisciplinary institute involving up to 50 academics across campus. So it's not just a network, it's really a community of scholars and researchers and educators across a breadth of different disciplines from biology, geosciences, law, engineering and the arts. And really the focus is on fostering multidisciplinary collaboration, and that's really how this event has unfolded. But I guess also, considering those of you in the room, MSI is also about building and supporting our next generation of future marine scientists and marine managers. All right, so we also just put up 2 slides here just to give some geographical context for the areas that we're going to be talking about in this panel session. So the purpose of the panel session is really to try and showcase MSI research, but also in a way that sort of engages in a broader conversation about a very topical issue and highlights different perspectives on this. So really we're focusing today on marine or maritime boundaries and climate change, and really looking at boundaries or maritime boundaries in different senses. So from a technical perspective, so when you think about, boundaries as having legal meanings, so dividing our ocean landscape or ocean seascape based on between different countries. Boundaries can also evoke other meanings, so social and cultural meanings, how we consider the coast as a divide between the land and the sea. And really, all of these different meanings are potentially impacted by climate change. So today we have 4, 5 different panelists who are going to give us different perspectives on these aspects of boundaries. And what I want to do now is really introduce these panelists. So we've got 2 here with us present, and we also have panelists online. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Tommy Fellows, who is a research fellow here in the School of Geosciences and very active in MSI. Tommy is a coastal and marine geoscientist who studies ecomorphodynamics and hydrodynamics and climate change impacts on coral reefs, sandy beaches and estuaries and bays. His current work explores the structural stability of low-lying coral islands that support legal maritime jurisdictions in rapidly changing ocean and climate. Mr. Ted Fraser, Nye, who's currently online.
Fraser will do.
Fraser, sorry, I keep turning around, but you're actually in front of me in the camera. So Fraser is a traditional owner from the Masig Islands in the Torres Strait, previously served 2 terms as a councillor for the Torres Strait Island Regional Council and on the Prime Minister's Advisory Council member, and currently is. Then we have also Mr. John Rainbird, who's a project manager for climate and coast for the Torres Strait Regional Authority. Hi, John. So John has been working for the TSRA for over 12 years and is focused on working with communities, researchers and government agencies across a spectrum of climate change and coastal issues to help prepare the Torres Strait for climate change. And Frances Anadi, who is an MSI researcher and PhD candidate in the Sydney University Law School. Frances is an international lawyer, and her current research is looking at the legal implications of climate change for maritime zones in the law of the sea. She's also a former legal advisor to the Australian government. And then we have Dr. Lara Maranagi Trott, who is also on our screen here. Hi, Lara. So Lara is a compliance manager at the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission in the Federated States of Micronesia. And Lara has served with the WCPFC since 2012. She's also a national of the Cook Islands and holds a PhD in international law from the University of Wollongong. Before joining the WCPFC, she was the WCPFC coordinator and policy advisor at the Pacific Islands Forum Fisheries. Fisheries Forum. And in agency in the Solomon Islands and a senior fisheries officer at the Cook Islands. More recently, she's been appointed as a UN Food and Agriculture of FAO organisation as one of the 12 international experts who prepared an international draft for the voluntary guidelines for transshipment, which were adopted and recognised internationally at the 2022 FAO Committee on Fisheries meeting. All right, well, welcome to all the panellists and also to the audience. So what I want to do just to start with is ask each of you, we might start with the panellists online, why is the topic of maritime boundaries and climate change important to you? So if we can start with John, that would be great, if you could answer that question.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. And I just I'm talking from Cairns, so this is Gimuri-Jinji and Guganji country, but respects to the traditional owners everywhere, and obviously my good friends and colleagues up in the Torres Straits. Well, the issue of maritime boundaries is particularly pertinent to the Torres Straits. It's a region that it really is on the front line of climate impacts. Communities live on mostly pretty small islands. So with the projections we have around issues like sea level, that's going to have a very significant impact on many aspects of life in the Torres Strait. It's a region that has quite complex boundary issues because it sits between Australia and Papua New Guinea. So there's some international space there as well. And I won't go into too much detail here, but there are many layers to boundaries in social, cultural, ecological boundaries in the Torres Straits as there are in many other places. So all of that's likely to shift and be impacted by climate change. And so it's getting a good understanding of what that means for the communities, what it means for the ecology. And of course, those two are very closely interconnected in places like Torres Straits, where culture and community health and well-being are intricately linked to people's connection to their land and sea country and the environment. So hopefully that gives you enough of a sense of why this topic is of relevance to us.
Thank you, John. Fraser, what are your thoughts on this topic of maritime boundaries and climate change?
Eleanor, thanks. And hey, thanks guys for having us on. And really looking forward to this. I'm from Masig Island. It's in the central islands of the Torres Strait, and we're little Coral Cay Islands. And my island is 2.7 kilometers long, and at its widest part, it's 800 meters wide. So it's a very, it's something that's really real, and the optics of it, where you live, you're just surrounded by water and everything else. But I'll start with the fact that with boundaries, what boundaries represent, within a boundary, first of all, I'll go from that way as a traditional Torres Strait Islander. Boundaries represent my identity because there's markers, there's stories, there's meanings that comes from those boundaries. Those parameters are now, our forefathers, our elders from past have defined those, and those definitions have defined my identity, our identity. So from that layer, from a cultural context, boundaries are really important. But we also share, and John touched on that, I think it's going to be really important in aspect of our community being a really small island, seeing high water mark, even that boundary. Like if we're talking, I'm just going to jump into that space where how that affects us, because we're seeing erosion taking place in our little parcel of land where we call home. And that affects us, and that shifts. There's a lot of things that are affected by that, by erosion. There's a lot of sites that are significant that are being washed away, and those meanings and stories are going with that, and we're losing out on that part. So it's a really important part if we look at from that small scale, the impact of that, but how that can translate into bigger things in years to come if we don't, manage it well and be good stewards of it globally, all of us. From a geopolitical point, we sit at such a nexus where there's two countries right there. There's a lot of Australians don't really understand because they don't have the contextual insight to see like, wow, PNG is just right there. That's another country, and Indonesia is just right there. Yes, it's right there. Like we've had prime ministers. I remember the former mayor said to me, they remember Simon Green came up years ago and they were standing on Saibai. It's the far northernmost community in Torres Strait. And he looked across to PNG and he was asking them like, oh, what's that island over there? And they go, that's Papua New Guinea, which is like 5 kilometers across. So it's so close. Until a lot of people come, until they see it, then they go, it does see it and have spatial awareness of proximity. And they go, wow, it's this close. Yes, it's this close. So there are other challenges that we're going to face, especially as we share fishing zones and stuff like that, and the impacts of that, and how we solve that problem, how we collaborate together is going to be of utmost importance into the future. Our stocks are affected on either side because fishes move and swim, resources underneath where our livelihoods come from, both sides because of proximity. That's going to really be challenging in the context of climate change as well. I guess I'll just stop there.
Thanks, Fraser. I think that's a really important point that you raised there, that certainly the biology doesn't confine itself to the jurisdictional boundaries, and that concept of proximity. Thank you. So we might just, I'll finish introducing the panelists, and then Mitch Gibbs has just joined us in the room, so we'll do an acknowledgement to country when we're finishing this. So Lara, what's your take on maritime boundaries and climate?
Hi everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I think Fraser's points probably were quite a nice lead in to the placement that I see myself in this discussion. The Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission is an intergovernmental tuna fisheries management organisation. So there are 41 seats at the table. Each member government sits at the table, and we've got some other cooperating countries. And so the basis for the way that the organisation runs is built on the foundation of the UN Law of the Sea Convention and the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, which gave the duty to cooperate to all the countries who are involved in fisheries, either as coastal states, as owners of the waters in which the tuna is found, or as fishing states who are harvesting the fisheries, who are port states who are looking to control the activities of vessels coming in and out of their waters, or as market states and processing states because they're receiving the product. And so the boundaries underpin the basis for cooperation between all the countries that are involved in coming together annually to make decisions about how tuna is going to be managed. Because we're in the Pacific, of course, climate change is a very important topic, and it's recognised as a very real threat to the livelihoods and land and islands on which all the countries are existing. In a fisheries context, it's also something that the scientists are starting to do a lot of modelling around, and it's indicating that there's going to be quite substantial shifts in the distribution of tuna across the Pacific, which raises all sorts of interesting challenges for the future, because management arrangements are based on where we understand tuna to be and where they've been harvested in the past. And we'll need to start looking and thinking about management arrangements that are going to be agile enough to be able to accommodate movements in tuna and adjustments and And there are also issues of fairness and equity where tuna has shifted from one country's waters to another, and there are benefits and offsets there. So there's a whole complex range of issues that that apply to the context that I work in, and the one that I hold very dear to my heart. And I'm looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have over the next little while. Thank you.
Thanks, Lara, and it's great to have your perspective on all of this. So I'll direct this question to Frances.
Sure. Thanks so much, Eleanor. Well, yeah, a little bit of a different perspective from some of the other speakers. As an international lawyer interested in the law of the sea, I've always been fascinated that one of the main goals of this part of international law is this dividing up that Eleanor mentioned. So what international law provides for in this space is a network of invisible lines that divides up all of the world's ocean spaces. Some spaces are called the high seas, over which no one country has exclusive control. And there are other different maritime zones which can be under more control of individual countries. So some of you might have heard about the exclusive economic zone, under which a country can exercise fisheries responsibilities, which Lara has also talked about. So that's the EEZs. Then there's also the zone that's closest to the coastline called the territorial sea, over which a country has sovereignty and can pretty much apply its laws almost like the same way that it does on land. And so one of the goals of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which Lara mentioned, was to establish a just and equitable way to divvy up the world's ocean spaces so that there were both rights of countries to do certain things and also responsibilities, for example, to look after the environment or what to do if there's a pollution incident, for example. So I've always been fascinated by, oh my gosh, what a huge goal for a law to have, to divide up the oceans and to assign these responsibilities. And then there are all these rules about how those maritime zones can actually be drawn in the sea, because unlike a coastal boundary, it's not an observable fact. It's something which needs to be decided and in some cases agreed. So for example, earlier this year in the Pacific, we had a maritime boundary treaty that was signed between Fiji and the Solomon Islands. Each of those countries is entitled to claim 200 nautical miles out for an EEZ. But when you draw those arcs from their coastlines, they overlap. And so in order to decide what to do with that overlap, the two countries have negotiated where to draw a line for their maritime boundary. And that's now been signed between the two countries. And there's a list of coordinates which now sets out where that boundary line is between them. So it's an important part of, I guess, relations between countries where those zones overlap. But if you think about, say, the Australian situation, sometimes like on the coast of WA, there's a lot of Indian Ocean on that side. And so measuring out 200 nautical miles from that part of the Australian coast doesn't really overlap with any other one country, just to the high seas. And so that's maritime boundary in a sense as well. So you might be wondering, how does climate change fit into this? Well, the rules in the law of the sea about how to establish these zones are all connected with the land, and particularly about special features of the coast, or if it's an island, or if it's a coral reef feature. So there are rules about what kind of features you need to have in order to develop those zones. And so now we always know that, of course, the land is dynamic, but of course, climate change really alters that scenario into the future. So the questions arisen in the legal domain: what are the impacts of climate change to these zones that have already been established by countries and the ones which haven't been established yet as well? So that's where some of my interest comes in.
Yeah, thanks,
Yeah.
Frances. I think that issue of negotiating boundaries and the complexity of the climate overlay makes things really interesting in that space.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. And Tommy.
So how do I fit into the conversation? So I'm a marine geoscientist, and what I do is that I study and look at different types of coastal features. So in today's discussion, we're talking about coral reefs and coral islands, the low-lying islands. And what really interests me is how they evolve through time based on different pressures, be it storms or sea level rise and things like this. All of these sort of factors that influence these features, as we know, are intensifying because of climate change. And we don't really know how the coral islands and the reefs that we use to support all these types of maritime zone systems are going to respond. And one of the clear sort of things is that not every island acts the same, and they come in so many different shapes and sizes, so it's quite hard to sort of paint one brush across all of them. But to sort of add to what Francis was saying about how the law of the sea is based, so if you hear me say baseline, that's the shoreline of the island or the reef or whatever the feature is. But in the case of coral islands, it's a little different to normal coastlines or continental coastlines, where the reef and the island are considered one biophysical system that kind of interacts with itself. So the baseline is actually drawn around the edge of the reef. And there's a definition, which is the low water line. So these are the questions that arise is what happens if the sea goes up or the reef erodes or the island that is on top of the reef disappears, which is a condition. You have to have the island to have the reef, etc. Does that answer? I think
Absolutely, Tommy.
Excellent.
Yeah. So we might just pause here for a minute because Mitch has just joined us, and it'd be great if we could start our next discussion before we start our next discussion with a acknowledgement to country from Mitch. Thank you. Yeah, organise a so we do, Mitch. We do have quite a few people online, and that's the camera.
Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you.
Yeah, but confusingly, confusingly, the room camera's over there.
So you don't
Yeah.
have the background.
Oh, yeah, I can see there.
Yeah. So that's
Sorry.
So I guess to acknowledge where we are now on Gadigal land, and I imagine obviously everyone on Zoom somewhere else, and acknowledge the land that you're on as well. To pay respect to the past, present, and elders emerging. I think in the context of today and the discussions, I think I'd like to think about the way in which our ancestors would always off the coast, like a lot of our borders were borders from rivers on land, but off the coast, we didn't really have those borders. And I know this may be different up north and up in Torres Strait, but I know where I'm from and around New South Wales and earlier or lower parts of Queensland, a lot of those places that are offshore have been shared, and they've been shared and respected by each other, and by what our ancestors have done to make sure that those places are protected, and making sure that everywhere that was a special place and continues to be a special place, was the place itself was respected, but also the guardianship from all those nations that had something to do with those places was respected and acknowledged by each and every one of those people that had something to do with it. So I think that just paying respect to those places from what our ancestors have done and making sure that it continues in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Mitch. So Tommy, recently you published a review on the biophysical processes that govern the structural stability of coral reef islands, which is what you've just been mentioning. And that really supports illegal maritime zones. So could you just give us a bit of insight on the main key points from that review and your comments on the future of coral islands in the face of changing oceans and changing climates?
Yes, so actually the three of us were on that paper and some of the people in the audience as well. But basically what we wanted to do is bring together what we know from the physical discipline and the biological discipline, and then add the legal one as well. But the narrative that we hear very generally in the media is that sea level rise is the only thing that might be threatening. And yes, it is very important, and it is probably the most rapidly changing thing. But what we sort of highlighted in the paper was that we need to consider, as I said before, that a reef is a living structure, and the living structure produces skeletons and shells and all that, and that's moved by waves across the platform, and then that creates islands over time. So the idea was to try and identify the threats to that mechanism or that process of where you have the biological producing sediment for an island, and also look at the physical threats to islands, so waves, sea level rise, and increased storminess. And just going back to the biological ones, we also highlighted how increasing water temperatures are threatening the sort of biological support system that supports these islands. Ocean acidification is another one. So there are so many moving parts to the problem. As I said before, it's quite difficult to figure out if every island is going to be the same. And climate change is not happening as this uniform threat. There are some locations that are far more exposed to elevated sea level rise, for example. The Southwest Pacific have sort of double the average sea level rise. They've also got some subduction, so they're getting even more. You have, so we sort of brought all that together and came up with, and we sort of identified that there are these two camps for the future of islands. So it's very unsettled. There are those that think that the islands will just drown and be destroyed as the sea gets warmer and higher and more stormier. And there's the other end of the spectrum that think that, you know, sea level's been going up and down for hundreds of thousands, millions of years. Maybe the reefs will be able to just adapt to the new conditions. And what we really highlight in the paper is that the elephant in the room, as Anna loves to say, is that sediments is the thing that's always left out. And the sediments are the things that support the island, and they come from the biota that live on there. So basically moving forward, we need to identify what kind of biota are producing the sediment for these islands, and maybe see if there are any canaries in the coal mine to be able to go, okay, well, we know this region has loads. The sediment's going to be reduced. Is that island going to become unstable because it won't be able to keep up? And these are the kind of questions that we want to ask.
And that's a really interesting perspective that we often don't hear in the media or think about in this context. Fraser, in your traditional lands of Massig Island in the Torres Strait, can you share with us some of the things that you're witnessing in terms of climate change impacts to your land and seascape? I guess I've got more than one question for you here, but in your earlier role as a councillor in the Torres Strait, what are some of the main climate change related issues you identified for Massig Island or the Torres Strait more generally? So there's two questions there that I'm putting to you.
Okay, I'll kind of just fire away and capture both of them in one go. Like I guess first of all, like, I mean, as a councillor, I'm also that's a TO, so it's kind of that interest. It's linked to my perspective of the impact. You know, I've just got just a title on. You know, that's about it. It still affects me. You know, the person, and I think, you know, we've seen impacts in erosion. And being such a small place, it's really pronounced when you see that. You know, it's only, like I said, the widest part is 800 meters. Then beyond that, it's only getting thinner. So you can really see the impact of change, and that it's not like if you're, and then this is a thing, when you're in somewhere there's scale like a continent or something, or a bigger island where there's kilometers and kilometers, you don't really notice, it's not as pronounced. But when you're at a smaller, then the magnification of that is much more greater. So it really, like, you know, I've seen elders, younger people being concerned about their future. So it really makes people anxious from that part onwards. Being such a small community, small island, small landmass, and thinking, how is this going to affect us? You see that. We see the erosion. We've seen, because a big part of our livelihood is the fishing sector, and we've seen coral bleaching in recent decades, and those things are a threat, the biggest threat to our livelihoods. We don't know how they will impact, you know, the crayfish industry, the prawn industry, the fishing sector, traditional food subsidy like green turtle and dugong. This is one of the largest marine, you know, habitat for them, I think, in the world. And we do have, you know, I think Torres Strait has a really great management plan, and John can speak on that as well. Being part of TSRA, working with communities, traditional owners, have a really good management plan in place for these things to look after. But the biggest threat is climate, is the impact of that. How do they affect the seagrass, the seabed where these things fit them, and that can totally obsolete or delete these marine life. and that can really affect us. But looking at even just coming from, I'm just going to jump over to council. Even as when I was a councillor, just seeing like the types of infrastructure we actually built. These are conversations where I see a really great intention, but really bad execution and thought out process in building the infrastructures in communities that will cater for the impact of climate change in 10, 15. I mean, when you're building a house, and this is what I've always been saying to leadership and to government, like that's an asset that'll be stuck on ground for the next 60 years. And if we're making projections out about the impact, then we should be designing for the worst case scenario. That thought through process should be interwoven into the design aspect or the malleability, or so it's malleable. So now we can shift, because out of that infrastructure, if it's great intentions, if there's overcrowding and you've just built for that, but if you didn't capture all the other projections and the other factors, then it's going to really set us up, because once it's stuck on ground. Once it's built, it's there. And it's a very costly exercise. And I get people to think through that. In 10 years' time, when people interface with that infrastructure, what does that experience look like? In the overwhelming conversation that we're having around, it's going to be hotter. It's going to be like this. It's going to be this. Where people are not factoring in, even from an infrastructure side, and taking time to think through this and how we build systems that are going to be, really smart, efficient. Because also there's the other aspect of running a community. It's expensive, especially in these little communities where we are. It is expensive to run a community, and there's efficiencies around all points, I think. But there's also a value proposition that around, I think we can build by really thinking through this stuff and these systems. And now one of the other challenges we face in all these little communities, remote communities, and we've found is the opportunities for jobs and stuff. I mean, you've got only a small, you don't have scale. You have little islands, 300 people, 400 people, 250 people dispersed all over the ocean. The logistical aspects to get there is costly. And we're trying to create an opportunity, to create some sort of opportunity in town, in ground. And I think part of that is this whole conversation is how do we create a leaner, cleaner community that is, that thrives on their culture, that incentivize the younger generation who have been caught up in so many ways with distraction from, social media and every other thing that young people are getting glued to everywhere, old people as well, for that matter. And it's about how do we really, I found, this is what I found, how do we really build that in this conversation of climate change, understand our challenges. These are the challenges we're facing. How do we position ourselves? How do we work with institutions, with companies, and really come together collectively and collaborate? I think this is such an awesome thing, MSI, the collaboration, because I think that's what it really needs. It needs a collaboration of minds to come together, because we only see parts, but together, I guess the synergy, the value that we see together, the collective lens, is much more worthy of what we're trying to create for the future. But these are some of the things I found that affects us. The temperature shifting, the weather pattern, the intangibles are shifting. We grew up knowing that the seasons were more pronounced, and you knew this was this season, that's the next season. Now there's a delay. Now sometimes you think there's no rain at all. And whereas when we were young and grew up for the longest of time and hearing it from our parents, because they learned it from their parents, our grandparents, there was this timeline where it was just in sync, where people can tell, and now it's all shifted, it's out of whack. And those things often are not captured. Those ecosystem value chain, people miss those certain things. And like what Tommy, you talked about, really having a deep dive into it and understanding what are the other things that are going to be really beneficiaries, so we can at least have knowledge to understand what the future might actually looks like in certain.
Sorry, I'll let you finish, Fraser.
No, in certain environment, yeah. And I think John will touch on, because we're very similar. John and I have kind of worked on this thing for the last decade, partnered in a lot of projects together.
No, I think you raise many really important key points there in terms of, you know, the resilience of infrastructure, the importance of community and opportunities for community, and then, you know, the importance really of collaboration, and hopefully these sorts of discussions can help address some of those things.
Yeah.
John,
If I may, Eleanor, really quick, because what we're trying to do is to build one thing. If there's one thing we can build, is optimism and hope. Because it's such a small parcel of land, and you're seeing it. You're looking that way 400 meters and that way from the widest point, and you're seeing this. But how do we drive hope when people can be, the ingenuity that lies within people to really look at the future and go, wow, this is an opportunity. I mean, I look at that and I go, wow, this is an opportunity. I'm so optimistic about the future. I get all the stuff that's happening, all the crazy stuff, but we just got to make a difference in the future. And this is about building that as well. Thanks.
Fantastic, thanks. And I think that may lead on to the question that I've got for you, John. Last year, you led the Torres Strait State of the Environment report for the TSRA. And it'd be great if you could tell us some of the key messages in that report. What are the key findings that relate to, you know, particularly to coastal areas, although it's sort of covered all environmental areas. And if you could just tell us a bit about how it has a broader significance as well, for example, in relation to coastal livelihoods, infrastructure and culture.
Yeah, certainly. So I guess fundamentally we've moved from a period of climate stability into a climate of variability now, and it's how we build flexibility into the system, I guess, is going to be a core consideration. So when we did the State of Environment report, I'll give you just a little bit more context on the Torres Strait. The Torres Strait is a very unique and very special part of Australia. As Fraser said, it's got the world's biggest dugong population, some of the most extensive healthy coral reefs and most resilient reef systems in the world. It's the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef, but here's another boundary issue, because there's a line that goes from the tip of Cape York out to sea. People forget that the Great Barrier Reef actually carries on beyond Cape York, and one of its most critical and important parts of the Great Barrier Reef is actually in the Torres Straits. Some of the biggest seagrass meadows, is extensive blue carbon. It's a very healthy part of the world because it hasn't suffered from a lot of industrial activity, even though it is an international shipping zone. But because of its particular situation, it's also kind of fallen between the cracks, and certainly a lot of the knowledge. So for example, the Australian government's put a lot of effort into supporting climate research in the Pacific, but that's funded through Department of Foreign Affairs. Because the Torres Strait is part of Australia, we missed out on a lot of that capacity to fund climate research. Because we're not part of mainland Australia, we missed out a lot of the research that happened there. So a lot of our job over the last decade or so has really been trying to plug information and knowledge gaps, because of the unique position that the Torres Straits has, where it's kind of very similar to the Pacific in many ways, but part of Australia. It's unable to participate in some of the schemes, the emissions avoidance reduction schemes, the RED programs that happen in other parts of the world, where you can capitalize on healthy blue carbon stocks. But because it's part of Australia, the extensive blue carbon stocks up there are not really of any value financially to communities, of which obviously they have extensive value in other ways. So when we put the State of Environment report together, we have been building up some very good knowledge around the marine and terrestrial ecosystems in the Torres Straits, but we still have some pretty big data gaps. But the overwhelming messages that come out are climate is definitely by far the greatest threat, particularly to the marine ecosystems. And there's a limit to what we can do in that space. So in terms of where we're working with people and communities and infrastructure, we have pretty good adaptive capacity to figure out how we can respond to certain things. But when you're dealing with coral reefs and turtles, there's a limit to what we can actually do to limit the impacts of climate change on those species and systems. So I guess where we're trying to go is continue to work with communities to deepen the understanding of how these things are likely to shift. And as Fraser alluded to, fisheries are one of the biggest economic activities in the region, but really important culturally and for subsistence fishing as well, ecologically. But they're definitely one of the big areas that we're kind of concerned about. And because a lot of the lines on maps have been developed during this period of relative stability, they can be a real hazard. Well, a challenge for us now, because if we're looking at things like fisheries management, as Laura pointed out as well, we're likely to see a lot of those species shifting spatially and temporally in terms of where they are. And so how we bring this flexible management into this whole space around how we manage resources, how we manage coastal infrastructure. We can't assume that things are going to stay the same. We can't assume that the location of something now is a good location into the future. We're having to really rethink so many things, where things go, their design, the long-term planning, because we're just in a completely new space now. The big challenge there is we work in a system that is very slow to change. And I guess some of the biggest challenges around how we respond to something like climate change sit within the mindsets and the governance structures in which we operate. So our big challenge is we got a pretty good idea of what we need to do in a place like the Torres Straits. But it's like turning a battleship around, because we're dealing with very historical ways of thinking, Western and traditional, and historical governance mechanisms that weren't geared up for this kind of situation we're in. So a big part of the challenge in this space is really how we shift our mindsets and governance structures so that they can meet the challenge of being in this very adaptive space where we need to be able to take more risks, where we need to be able to try new ideas, be innovative and flexible, because historically that's not really the sorts of systems we've been working in.
I think the ship analogy is a good one in terms of the pace that some institutional responses operate. Thanks, John. So my next question is for Francis. International law recognises the right of coastal states to set up an invisible network of lines in the sea, and that really then divides up ocean spaces into maritime zones that you mentioned before. So I guess there's a debate going on right now about whether these lines, maritime boundaries, might be disrupted by climate change impacts, and certainly the other panellists have alluded to these as well. Why is that a concern, and where is that debate going?
Yeah, thanks, Eleanor. Yeah, I guess the reason why this question has come up, as I mentioned before, is the legal rules set up this close connection between what happens with the land and what states are able to do with their ocean space. And so I guess as a matter of first principles, that's how the question has arisen. And when these rules were set up in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, this was negotiated in the lead up to the 80s. It was agreed in 1982. At that time, climate change was really not something that was a prominent issue in the international community, and absolutely not kind of a prominent, high up in the agenda at the United Nations, which was like where the UN Convention was obviously negotiated. So it wasn't in the minds of the negotiators at the time. And so what's happened is, as legal scholars have started to think about this issue, and I mean, they've actually been thinking about this issue since pretty soon after that document was negotiated. So about the late 80s, kind of early 90s, we had some legal scholars starting to put two and two together. Oh my goodness, these maritime zones we've just set up, are they actually going to shrink if the islands shrink? What happens if an island actually submerges? Because these are some of the projections coming out of the assessment reports coming out of the UNFCCC framework. So IPCC started making these projections. What's going to happen if we actually have total submergence of these features supporting these enormous fishery zones? Now, at the time, the UN Convention, I said, they didn't think about it. There's nothing in the rules that says anything about these possible disappearances. And legal scholars, most legal scholars still today hold the view that, oh yes, if one's connected to the other, their fates are tied together. We're going to have shrinking maritime zones. We're going to have disappearing fishery zones. And so that's a real fear. So if we just think about that possibility, it's actually got huge consequences. So I tried to, Tommy helped me come up with a couple of examples to illustrate the scale of that kind of scenario. So if you think about, for example, there's an island in Micronesia called Kapinamarangi Atoll, which is in the southern part of FSM. And so it's their southernmost island. It's quite a small atoll feature. The loss of that, the EEZ around that atoll, would mean a loss of over 100,000 square kilometres of EEZ for that country. That's pretty huge. And then I guess in an Australian context, we thought of another couple of examples. The Cocos Keeling Islands, which are small Australian islands up towards the northwest of Australia, they generate 467,000 square kilometres of EEZ. I'm looking at that to make sure that I've got all the zeros correct. Most of which is a marine park. So there's actually a huge protective element that comes with the declaration of the EEZ around the Cocos Keeling Islands. And that represents about 6% of the total Australian EEZ. So, you know, a tiny feature is really important for the totality of Australians' EEZ. And then Tommy also reminded me about the Coral Sea Marine Park over on the East Coast. That's about 1 million square kilometres, roughly equivalent to the land size of the entire state of South Australia. So also an enormous area, obviously of huge cultural significance, but also there's a huge protective element of actually having a jurisdiction over that area as well. So that's the kind of sizes that we might be talking about. So if this actually were to happen, this consequence, it would actually be, it is something to be feared. It is something that we want to avoid. And so what legal scholars started to say was, well, if this is going to happen, we're going to have to go back and redo that deal again. We're going to have to renegotiate UNCLOS. And the thing is, in today's geopolitical context, that's not going to happen. That actually just isn't a feasible way of approaching the issue. One of the things then that we started thinking about is whether there is evidence of any other way of looking at the legal rules to see whether actually they may have evolved since the 1980s, whether there's actually any capacity for those rules to change and make more sense for the situation we've got today. And listening to some of the speakers before about, Fraser was talking about, you know, hope and leadership for the future. We've noticed that, for example, many of the countries which are facing these realities have actually taken a leadership role in advancing this issue on a global stage. So, for example, last year, some of you might know that the leaders of the Pacific Islands Forum, which is a grouping of 18 Pacific Island countries, of which Australia and New Zealand are also part, their leaders signed a political declaration saying that our maritime zones will be preserved, notwithstanding the effects of sea level rise. And so that has, like, all the heads of state have actually agreed that position, that that is what they envisage the future to be. And then a month later, the Association of Small Island States, which includes some of the same Pacific countries, but also across other small island regions in the world, like the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean, also signed a similar declaration. So we've heard from about 40 countries already, just over 40 countries, I think, who've expressed the view that in their country's view, their maritime zones will be preserved in the face of sea level rise. And so that's a really interesting development. And maybe just before I wrap up, Eleanor, I also just mentioned that it's not just political statements. So I guess one of the things about international law is that it matters what states say, especially if it converges with what states do, so with the practice of states. And so one of the things that we've been trying to shed a bit of light on, say in my doctoral research, is that it's not just politician statements that's happening here. We can also observe that the parliaments of these countries have been setting up their maritime zones in a particular way. So I know that a lot of you here will be very familiar with coastal surveying techniques. And so that's been a big part of it as well, taking an accurate understanding of the location of a coastline at a particular point in time, setting out an authoritative list of coordinates to describe that location, and then putting that list of coordinates in their laws to say, this is where our maritime zones are. They are this list of coordinates. Law. So yeah, so there's a bit of a convergence there in political statement as well as action, which could influence international law.
And I think that's what makes it really interesting, but also the figures that you just gave just really highlight the vastness of these areas, these very large marine states, and the importance of that for countries in these areas. Thanks. So I just also suggest if anyone's got their microphone in the audience on, it'd be great if you could turn it off just so it doesn't sort of flick the camera around the room and bring up screens that could cause a distraction. So Lara, my next question is really for you. So the lines in the sea are key part of the work that you're involved in fisheries management in the Western Central Pacific. There's, in particular, there's a line encircling the convention area that you're responsible for, and there's also a nearby area, EEZ line, for individual countries. Can you tell us about why these different lines are important in your work and the role they play in the aims of the WCPFC relating to both sustainable use and conservation of these high sea areas for fisheries?
Sure. Happy to contribute. And I thought it might be helpful just to put this slide up. I don't know if you can see that.
Right.
Yeah. So this is the area of waters that the WCPFC manages. So this is where 50% of world's tuna is sourced from this particular area, and so it's the area to the left of the red line, which includes Australia, New Zealand, all throughout the Pacific, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, all the way up to parts of Asia. And so you can see just from looking at that map that maritime boundaries are an important part of underpinning the actual management arrangements in the Western and Central Pacific. I think in some ways it's also a form of order for the management arrangements. All the countries know where they're located. They know what is waters within their jurisdiction in the way that Francis was describing. And as a result of them knowing what is within their sovereign rights to manage and to receive benefits from, they then have their own identity within the Commission that they bring when the Commission has to make decisions by consensus, where every member government agrees along the lines of what Francis was describing with declarations. Those are the sorts of decisions that are made by the Governing Council of the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission. So I just wanted to show that that slide to just put a bit of a picture on things. So I think, as I said in my introductory remarks, the organisation is charged with ensuring the long-term conservation and sustainable use of tuna. So it's quite a complex context for decisions to be made because member governments all come together. They include some of the most powerful countries, and it's in the backyard of the Pacific. It's the Pacific Island region. So we've got the geopolitical dimensions that come into play. We've got the maritime boundaries that come into play. We've got emerging effects of climate change. And so it's trying to come up with management arrangements that achieve that objective, but at the same time are going to be agile enough and robust enough to make sure that they're going to hold as time goes on. And if there are changes to climate, to ocean circulation, to maritime boundaries and maritime jurisdictions as a result of things like climate change. So boundaries, I think, are a really important feature of how WCPFC as an intergovernmental organisation operates. So yeah, that's probably the main points that I really wanted to make. So one of the features that we are expecting from climate change based on models that have been derived is that there would be an eastward shift in tuna stocks. So instead of them, a lot of the tropical tuna fisheries, the tuna that you would buy in a can, skipjack, being caught in the west, closer to Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, that the tuna stocks are predicted to move more towards the central part of the Pacific, close to places like the Cook Islands, French Polynesia, which creates additional possibilities for those countries, but lesser opportunities for countries who currently are able to secure good economic returns from those fisheries in their waters. And so that's quite an interesting dynamic and new identities or new potential identities for a number of countries, and their involvement with the tuna fisheries. And probably the last point is that there is a line down the middle of the Pacific, and there is a sister organization, the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission, which is responsible for the eastern half of the Pacific and those fisheries. And so the effects of climate change, if they occur the way that the models are indicating they could, the Eastern Pacific will end up with a greater share of Pacific tuna than the West. And so there's going to be a need for greater cooperation between the two halves of the Pacific, and there'll be potential for greater mixing between the different parts of the Pacific compared to what we're currently used to as our understanding of the tuna dynamics and the ocean circulation dynamics. And so that creates some interesting and a greater need for cooperation between the two organizations than might necessarily be the case right now. So those are the thoughts I wanted to contribute at this particular point in the discussion, and I'll hand back to you.
Thanks. I think that's a really great point to end this discussion on, in terms of, you know, those shifts in the share of resources and what that means also in terms of boundaries. So what I'd like to do now is open up the discussion to questions from the audience here in the room, and also from the audience on Zoom, and we'll manage that so that people on Zoom can put your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure that they get answered. But we might start with questions in the room, and certainly. Do you want to do the yeah. So actually, one strategy we came up with, Tommy and Francis' idea they had, was to actually encourage everyone to sort of contribute their thoughts to these discussions, because I think we've had some really interesting points and arguments raised. And so we have a Mentimeter, and some of you may have used this little tool before, and please, you know, you can put in all sorts of words and change the way that the word cloud sits. But Annika's just putting the link to Mentimeter in the chat. So you can just click on that, or you can type it in, and that's the password. So what we'd really like you to do is just put a few words in that sort of come to mind from the discussions that we've had just now, and in terms of these sort of lines in the sea and lines in the sand. It'd be interesting. I guess we're kind of curious to see how this sort of unfolds in your minds. Yeah. So as this is sort of popping up, we'll get you to ask questions in the room. Mitch, we'll start with you.
I guess my question goes to Fraser. So I was talking to a brother down, it was in Melbourne, but he's from up at Torres Strait. You might know him as Francis Nonna. And he was talking about, or we were just chatting about, I guess, the cultural implications that occur probably from climate change, and how people are going to be taken or moved from islands possibly in the future where their culture has been, but then going to a place where their culture isn't, and then I guess the implications from that. So I guess I wanted to hear your perspective on being able to move from one place to another and then keeping that culture that you would have, but also not intruding on the culture that's already at the other islands, being any sort of changes in tradition or changes in any sort of cultural aspect, I guess.
Fraser, you might be on mute there. Oh,
Yep. Okay. Sorry.
Yep, we can hear you now.
Yeah. No. Thanks for that question. Look, I think it's a very interesting question, and it's a very prudent question for us to consider. It's something I consider a lot and talk to people about. You know, the impacts of these changes and what does that mean? Like, you know, there's a community called Saibai in Torres Strait. They first moved because it's a low-lying mudflat community. It's one of the ones I mentioned before, right at the end of Torres Strait on the northernmost part. They moved in 1946, I think. There was two movements. They moved to the Cape of the tip of Australia, the Cape, the far north tip of Queensland. They moved there, and there's the community today of Bamaga and Seychelles, and they're predominantly Torres Strait Islander community that's been accepted into there by traditional owners from the Cape, and they were the first to move. And I speak to a lot of those mates of mine, our bros from those communities, and I say some of them have never been back. Some of the kids have never, you know, they're 3 generations, 4 generations down have probably been back home once. And we come back to about location. Meanings are created from those locations, our identity, our stories. It's only told on that space. It's defined from that over there, you know, and that's how we create. And when you shift out of that, you lose that. And I think those cases are really interesting to see the dynamics for us to learn. And I share that with people is, if we have to move, let's look at those case studies. They've played out before us, way before. Let's look at other communities around the world that have moved for whatever reason, but still for thousands of years later, still carry their culture strong, and they've been dispersed all over other parts of the world. What was the thing that allowed them to still keep their culture? And I am really interested in that space, because it is one, you know, I think we have to really start to strategize, and those conversations have to be really real. I know it's confronting. People don't want to talk about those things, but we have to plan for a worst case scenario and start to have those conversations now. And I use an example of that. I said, here's an easy anecdotal evidence of someone shifted from their country. You go to a kid from Masigu, born down south and lived all their life down south. There you go. That's what it looks like. They're from here, their dad's from here, or mom from up here, but they've grew up, right? That's the impact of not being on country right there. Because they've grown up, they know all the stories, but it's not contextual, it's not real, because they've never been here. And those are nice little things that I look at and I share with people, and get us to, you know, provoke our thinking around, like, how do we plan and strategize those shifts as well? Because like you said, I mean, if we're going into about building relationship now with communities, don't wait until the time comes. It's about how do we start to build those relationships with certain communities. If there is a movement into those spaces, you know, learn from others. How did those that accepted, like I talked about, by the mob from the tip of Australia that have accepted Torres Strait Islanders there. What were the variables? What were the conditions? And it was bravery from their part. The old people that left, like, to never come back. We often don't consider those things. We just talk about they've just moved. And I say to people, I said, we have to come from a point of empathy and understand, because it's a very human thing. And I think this comes back to this bigger idea of how we will face this other challenge. It's not just policies, and that these things are really important, but at the end of that is humanity. And that part is where we solve the real issues from a place of empathy, from a place of understanding, to first understand, then to be understood. And that's a confronting thing to a lot of people, because it's all about me, what I can get out of this. And in a world where we live in, it's just like cutthroat, it's about our interest. but we take our place back to that fundamental part. As humans, how do we face this challenge? How do we have a conversation and create the human family? Because that's how we're going to solve it. Because I think because I've seen it, like the best policy is the best, investment, they only amount to so much, because the humans that live there will dictate how the rest of the experience is felt. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's all about like, how do humans connect at a heart level, connect at a empathy level of what is our fears and vulnerabilities, our hopes, and how do we stitch that up from that point to create a future for our kids and for their kids. But thanks for the question. Look, I think it's such an important one, and it's something that is often not spoken about in context with climate change. It is spoken, but not in the point of what is the strategy? How do we start having these conversations in a really real way? Not with fear, but with hope.
Yeah, I think that was a really great
Right?
question.
Does that make sense, you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was a really great question and a really interesting response too, important response. Do we have other questions in the room? Yeah, Peter.
In some ways, Fraser's just answered the question, but from a science point of view, what we study is change, geohistorical change. That's and the processes that drive that along. So for us, change has always been happening and always will keep happening. And now there's another dimension to it due to climate change. But I suspect in traditional societies, there's been a perspective on change, those changes, the ones I was just talking about, you might call them natural, historical and prehistorical change. There's probably cultural perspectives on that already, which Fraser was sort of alluding to in more recent history. But like with many things that we're only just learning in the dominant society, there's traditional societies have a lot to teach us about this sort of stuff. And I suspect Fraser would say that if they look into their own history, there will be traditions in the culture that can teach us a lot about responses to these future changes, because they've been responses to past changes as well.
So is that a question you want to? Would you like?
Well, I was going to ask
Direct that to Fraser, yeah.
If he
past
can see those sort of things in the culture, or maybe it's something that needs to be thought about for a little while, and then he will see more and more of them. They've actually always been there, and what can we learn from them? The traditional perspectives.
Look, it's I'll try and answer, because I think about change. And we all know change is a constant. It is an inevitable part of life, and I think having perspective. And I often think about this, like we are where we are. It was always meant to be this way, whether we like it or not. This is the reality of the world we live in, and we are the humans who are facing the change that's happening at this time. For all the reasons humans have developed from all the different ages to where we are now in the post-industrial age 2.0. And this is the challenge we're facing. But I think what indigenous mob all over the world, I was saying to someone, I said, we've kind of been the ones that have adapted all along, all of us for that matter. We've adapted to change, and that's why we sit in this room today. We just didn't just get here. There were humans thousands of years ago, all of us, even looking into that room, your ancestors as well. They have adapted as well, all of us, to where we are sitting right now having this conversation. And I think there's a whole lot that we can learn from that. I was saying to a mate of mine the other day, I said, often, and to your question, brother, is often, especially in the indigenous community, government comes across with the biases of they have the answer, they have the solution, only to see for the last 60 years, the outcome's not even on target. That's the feedback loop of that intelligence, of that wisdom. Whilst this is important, it misses the point. It's a bias that allows them not to see that there's another wisdom as well. that it needs to marry together. And there's a value proposition that sits within that marriage that we can really shift the world. Because we've always been changing. We have contextual insights of our land, our world. And that's often undervalued, I think. You know, our doctors, our university is the universe. The walls is the sky. The ceiling of our universe is the sky. The things that we've learned from it, the environment around us. And for a long, you know, I think for the longest of time, it's been undervalued. And we need to revisit those things.
Thanks.
Because all of us collectively together need each other.
Thanks, Fraser.
Sorry.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Peter. I might, and I can see there's a lot of questions coming up in the chat, so I might get Anna to read out one of the chat questions.
Okay, so I'm going to read one, which is first they say thank you for a very interesting panel. And this question is for Georgette Matthews. So how is climate change framed in the ongoing negotiations for a new treaty on marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction? And to what extent the BBNJ treaty will affect the climate change management within the national jurisdiction?
So I'm sorry I can't actually give a proper answer to. Is this any better? I'll just check. Yep. Okay, let's try.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So, yes, so I know that those conversations are happening at the UN level, and they've been extremely protracted and have been absolutely vexed. So I understand from colleagues that it's very close to a resolution, and so maybe this year, maybe next year is what colleagues have told me from the Australian negotiating team. But it's been kind of almost 10 years again to actually get to that stage. So that's one thing in terms of the geopolitics. Now, in response to your actual question as to how climate change impacts are feeding into the biodiversity questions, I'm sorry, I can't actually help you with that. But I would say that it's related to some of the things that we were talking about before, because they're the same lines, if you like. So the area beyond national jurisdiction is the area on the other side of all the EEZs, if you like. And so the same uncertainty about all the EEZ lines, for example, affects what areas might be covered by any of the protections that are gained in any new treaty. So I guess from that point of view, there is a connection between the two regimes, and hopefully it'll be a coherent one. But yeah, watch this space. I'm sure we'll all hear when that treaty is concluded.
Great. Maria, you've got a question in the room. Oh, sorry.
Yes, this is I was going to follow up on this because there's been a lot of focus on the high seas fisheries of late. And if the island nations do maintain, and if those maritime boundaries maintain as they are now, even if, Lara, the tuna goes east, you'll still have EEZs that will protect that tuna. So if that tuna, if those maritime boundaries change, because island nations lose their sea monuments or whatever it is that maintains their EEZ, then the benefit of maintaining those EEZs is that those tuna are now, or any other resources, are now not going to be in what would be considered the high oceans, that where there is no law of the sea, where exploitation is not controlled. So this is where I feel there's even if you've got all the nations in the Pacific, they've been working together and the tuna fishery has been going. But if you didn't have those nations working together, I don't think you'd have the tuna fishery in the state that it's in now. And if the laws of this, if the maritime boundaries go, then it'll be a free-for-all.
Great to get your perspective on that, Lara.
Thank you for the question. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch your name, but a very, very interesting question, and thank you for listening so intently to my comments earlier. Yeah, I think it would be, there would be a number of backward steps in the regime governing marine spaces if maritime boundaries of all countries were to somehow be scrubbed out as a result of shifting baselines due to sea level rise and the like. I can't. I've been sitting, thinking, reflecting as we've been talking about what having no maritime boundaries might mean to the way that the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission operates, and I think it would, yeah, it would just totally disrupt all the arrangements and the understanding and the long history of cooperation and governance. Just as the speaker had explained, it would be something that would be quite chaotic and not a great thing. So the important role that the Western Central Pacific plays is that it as a fisheries management organisation, we provide the mechanism that allows the arrangements across the full range of the tuna stocks. So we recognise the exclusive economic zones and the sovereign rights of those countries to manage their fisheries, and we recognise that they probably are best placed to manage the fisheries in their waters, and they have the most at stake, particularly because they're small island developing states who understand the importance of those resources, and that's part of their whole nationhood and livelihood for many of them. But we also bring all the countries together who are fishing, as well as having a vested interest in those stocks. And so the organisation itself is responsible for managing. It's the decision making that occurs every year as the Commission that ensures that there are arrangements for high seas management. And as you correctly said, as the speaker said, it's ensuring that the tuna stocks of the Pacific are staying in the green, because the cooperation between those countries, even though negotiations are hard, sometimes tough, and very slow, they are ensuring that there are rules and everybody is, the checks in place are in place to make sure that those rules are robust, and that there is good management. So I think we're hoping that the future is bright, and there is more to be done. The harvest strategy work that the Commission is working on should actually make sure that there's pre-agreed decisions for what happens if there are changes in stock distribution, or we underestimate the impact of fishing, and some drastic cuts need to be made in the fishery. What will happen and how those changes will take place are things that are presently being worked on, and it's about understanding that we don't know what the future is going to hold, and we need to have processes in place that can react quite quickly to change. So thank you for the interesting question.
Thanks, Lara. We'll take another question from online, I think.
There are no questions.
No more questions online. Okay, but we do have questions in the room. So Connor. Oh, it'll be faster, Anna.
I just had a quick question building off of kind of what Maria was talking about, geared towards you, Lara, as well. I mean, it's one thing to have those exclusive, economic zones and those maritime boundaries, but what's being done as far as enforcement on those? Just speaking with a lot of local fisheries, and I've spent a lot of time out at sea, it's pretty easy for specific countries, specific longliners to go into an exclusive economic zone, turn off your AIS, or perhaps even there's newer strategies of injuring like a crewman and then coming into land and getting kind of health repairs for that boardman or that crewman, and then going back out to sea, and on the way back out to sea, dropping your long lines and kind of pillaging the reef on the way out, even in those economic zones. And it's, of course, enforcement's super hard. It's kind of a wild frontier out there, but what can be done, and are there steps being done to better enforce, to, you know, again, drawing a boundary is one thing, but if you're not abiding by those rules, it's not super efficient.
Would you like me to respond?
Yeah, that would,
Yeah.
that question was directed at you.
Yeah.
Lara.
Okay. Yeah. So my job title is compliance manager. So you've just and I've just completed yesterday our technical and compliance committee meeting, which is the arrangement that where all the MCS practitioners, the monitoring, control and surveillance and enforcement officers all get together. You've probably opened a Pandora's box, but that compliance is the area of my specialty at the Western Central Pacific. So one of the things that we've got as a tool is that we've got vessel monitoring system on all vessels. We've also got ability to board and inspect vessels out in the high seas, and that's used quite readily by France, United States, Australia and New Zealand. And the activities, the aerial surveillance, the use of opportune naval vessels coming in means that they can go in and board foreign vessels and provide a report back to us on the findings of those reports. And the meeting that was held last week, part of what they do is review those reports and the responses by flag states to those. So there's those sorts of checks and balances in place. The other thing that the Pacific has, which sort of comes back to some of the points that Fraser was referring to, there is already inbuilt cooperation within the Pacific region. So the Forum Fisheries Agency, which is based in Solomon Islands, they run regular aerial surveillance patrols where they coordinate with Australia, with New Zealand, with Australia, with the United States, with France. Sometimes they're coordinating with Canada. Other times they're coordinating with Japan and other Asian nations, and they're also checking to see if the boats that we're expecting to have on VMS are all reporting to our system and to the FFA system where that's required. So those patrols are regularly done. And so whilst we don't know, we can't say with confidence that we know that every vessel out there is doing what they should be. We've got a fairly good handle on it. And the other thing that I do as part of my job is prepare reports, which is a report card for each country on whether or not they're meeting the obligations and the commitments that they've made to the Commission to conserve and manage the fisheries, but also to control their vessels. And so that's an important part of what we were doing last week. So I think there's a lot more out that's occurring to cover the Pacific and ensure Pacific tuna fisheries than what it might seem. And labour standards and crew safety and observer safety is also an important part of those checks and balances that we're doing in the Pacific.
Great, thanks, Lara. It's great to have your expert insight on that too. Anna, you had one last question. We might make this the last question before we wrap up.
Let's stand here so you can see me. So my question is, we have seen in the last few weeks in the news all of these things about how Torres Strait, an international law, Francis, sorry, what I'm probably saying it wrong. Someone said that Australia has a duty of taking care of addressing climate change, and that the Torres Strait Islands, there was a group of people that went to the international law for something and they won. I would like to know what that means. What are the implications?
I take it that's for me.
I don't know. I don't know if it's for Francis, Fraser, John.
Maybe I'll start off, Fraser, and then you want to come in after and add some as well. So yeah, we've seen a lot of a big spotlight on the Torres Strait Islands. Island bound to a UN body called the Human Rights Committee. So it's not a court or a tribunal. It's a kind of quasi-judicial entity. Sorry. So the Human Rights Committee is it's an expert body specializing in a different area of international law. It's human rights law. And so they were asked the question, because of this was in the words of the authors, the people who made the case, the Australian government, in failing to reduce its emissions and to take actions in the Torres Strait, have breached certain human rights of the Torres Strait Islander people. And they alleged a few different things. They said that it affected their right to life, that affected their right to freedom from interference from their family, and also their rights to culture. And so last week, the reports came out that the Human Rights Committee thought that there was still some chance that some of the mitigation efforts could still occur. So there wasn't an imminent risk to the right to life. And so that argument fell away. But it did find that the Australian government had breached the claimants' right to protect and their culture, and including not just for the present generation, but the future generations of the family claimants. And also right to family life as well. And that referred to even the practical impacts on the homes of the claimants. And so right to family life, they said, encompass things like, the integrity of your dwellings, for example. And so what happens then, Anna, you were saying the committee said that the Australian government should pay compensation to the claimants in relation to those breaches, and should also take steps to avoid these things happening in the future. But the thing is that the Human Rights Committee rulings are not the same as from a court. So they're not binding on Australia or any other government. They're, I think in the books we would say authoritative, but not binding, whatever that means. So we now need to wait. I'm not sure if we actually heard from the Australian government how they propose to respond. Yeah, Maria's shaking her head, no. So we'll have to wait and see what the official response is. But certainly the finding is the first one in which an international body has said that the human rights of persons in relation to family and culture are impacted by climate change impacts. So pretty huge, yeah.
Thanks, Francis. Fraser, just before we finish up, it'd be really great to get your take on, what that means for your communities.
I mean, I guess Francis has explained, we're all kind of waiting. We're all waiting to see that part, but it's definitely put the government on notice. And I think, the other part of the conversation is there's a lot of, coming back to when we had the climate change conference up here where John facilitated, and I was saying to them, like, we should be looking at partnering. We don't do enough with partner Torres Strait with our Pacific brothers and sisters in driving, because this is one issue that affects all of us right across the board. And there's some geopolitical tension that's at play as well with China. We understand those issues, those conversations that are playing out. And I think, the relationship Australia has with those Pacific brothers and sisters of us, I think there's some leverage point where we can, being Australians and in the backyard of Australia, or the front yard, if you want to say, being affected by that, there's some strategic positioning we can actually do together by leveraging with one issue that affects all of us, but we can leverage from our brothers and sisters, or the Australian government is also trying to, you know, negotiate their relationship with them in regards to what's happening in, you know, with China. And I think, you know, I look at that, I think that they're all grounds or for us to be smart and strategic in how do we drive this conversation in understanding some other issues and position ourselves together to, you know, to have this conversation. And, you know, the rest is we just, I guess, have a look what the response is if it's not binding, you know. But things like that, I have seen people, one of the claimants is from my community. My community was one of them. And I've seen the joy and optimism, you know, in them and thinking, what's this going to look like? But it's not also for them to, you know, we're trying to get our young people. It's also the other stuff we can actually do to show, let's become a region in Australia that is the most eco-sustainable region. So that gives us more nows to drive our case and argument. But the rest is just, I guess, where we all don't know. We just got to wait.
Yeah, but it sort of links back to your earlier comment on optimism. So just before we finish off, though, I was wondering, John, do you have any comments that you want to make on this, considering that you're involved in some of these discussions? Lost you.
Sorry. Sorry about the close-up of my beard. Look, I can't actually comment because I work for the Australian government and it's a case against the Australian government, but hopefully as Torres, Fraser, have another friend called Torres, who's a mutual friend. It's all about how we work together going forward is the really critical thing. I mean, it's you know, we've got a new government. There's a much greater focus on tackling this issue. And there is a lot of cause for optimism. We know we're into a period of significant shift. The critical question here is how bad those shifts are going to be. And that's going to come down to the international cooperation on this issue. So all going well, governments around the world are really going to step up their action on this because I guess there is the possibility for creating a really strong future. But at the same time, we know there are some serious limits around our ability to respond to this issue in terms of how bad it can get. There are limits to our capacity to adapt that we haven't seen in many, many eons, this kind of potential condition coming to Earth systems. So all fingers crossed that we can avoid that more extreme end of the impacts, but there is a huge amount of goodwill, and the Torres Strait is an amazing place. It's an enormous privilege for people like myself to be able to work there and with the beautiful people there. And there's, you know, there's plenty of cause for us to still be very optimistic about building a very resilient future based on combination of innovation and culture together, creating a pretty new and neat way for people up there to persist into the future.
Thanks, John. All right, well, we'll leave it on that note. But first of all, I'd like to really thank or ask you to join me in thanking the 5 panelists. I think we generated some really quite thought-provoking conversations, and I'm sure we'd like to continue those conversations as well. So we'll just thank the panelists, and then we might have a look at the word cloud that's been generated. And in addition to this, I'd also really like to thank Francis and Tommy, because they have done an amazing effort to pull this together to identify a really brilliant panel of experts with coming from a breadth of expertise and life experience and sectors as well. So Tommy and Francis, thank you. That's been fantastic. And just looking now at the cloud, it is really interesting to see that in the middle of that is, in very bold, is cooperation, collaboration. Interesting, we've got other words here: politics, resilience, boundaries and challenges. and, you know, and opportunities. And I think that's really a great way to end this. And I think this summarizes it nicely, and hopefully you walk away, particularly in this room, we have, you know, the future people that are going to be addressing these challenges, and you're in this room, we've got many students, postgraduate and some undergraduate students as well. And it's great to be able to have these discussions and as part of your degree program, but also to see where you might take some of these ideas. All right. Thank you.